Dawn broke cold over the blackened ruins. Eleanor stood alone where her ranch house had stood for 20 years, watching smoke curl from charred timbers like the last breath of something dying. Ya make him sabre? Frost glittered on ash, turning destruction into something almost beautiful, if you didn't know what it meant. She held a fire-blackened tin cup in her weathered hands, the only thing she'd managed to save. The morning air smelled of burned wood and broken dreams. Her barn was a skeleton of charred beams pointing accusingly at the pale sky. The chicken coop. The tool shed. The covered porch where she'd sat with her late husband on summer evenings, all reduced to smoking rubble. Landor. 20 years of building, of sweat and sacrifice, scattered by raiders in a single night. She heard horses before she saw them. 3 riders from town, part of the group that had chased the raiders too late to matter. They pulled up at a respectful distance, hats in hands. Mrs. Carson, the lead rider said. His name was Webb, a merchant's son who'd never worked a day outside his father's store. We're mighty sorry we didn't catch them in time. Eleanor said nothing. Just stood there, gripping that blackened cup. You got family in Denver. Don't you? Webb continued, clearly uncomfortable with her silence. Might be you should wire them. This ain't no country for a woman alone, especially a widow. The other 2 riders shifted in their saddles. One was young, barely 20, with soft hands and city clothes, helpless as a kitten. She heard him mutter to his companion, what's a woman like that gonna do without a man's protection? Eleanor's hands tightened on the cup until her knuckles went white, but she didn't speak, didn't defend herself, didn't explain that she'd faced down worse than cowardly raiders in the dark. Beckshire? Her silence made them nervous, as if they'd expected tears or hysteria, or some feminine breakdown they could handle with awkward pats and empty promises. Well, Webb finally said, you need anything. You come to town. We'll help however we can. They rode off, glancing back once or twice, as if expecting her to call out, to beg, to need them. Eleanor watched them disappear into the cottonwoods lining the creek. Only then did she allow herself to move. She walked slowly through the ruins, cataloging what remained. The stone foundation was solid. The well still drew clean water. Her root cellar, built deep and covered with earth, had survived intact. Not everything was lost, just most of it. Eleanor set the blackened cup carefully on a flat stone, something scarred but unbroken. Like her gaze lifted to the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already white with early snow. Those same mountains where she'd once tracked predators through November cold, where she'd proven herself capable of things most men couldn't imagine. Gah. Her hands still remembered the weight of a knife, the terrible clarity that came with survival. I've started over before. She whispered to the wind, to the ruins, to herself. The sun climbed higher. Eleanor began sorting through the ashes, looking for anything worth saving. And 2 days later, Eleanor walked into town. She'd rigged a lean-to shelter from salvaged canvas and spent her nights there. Too stubborn to accept charity from neighbors she barely knew. But stubbornness didn't put flour in the larder or replace lost tools. The general store smelled of coffee and leather and possibility. Mr. Hawkins stood behind the counter, his expression shifting from surprise to pity when he saw her soot-stained dress. Fopperdiene, Mrs. Carson, he said carefully. I heard about the trouble. You need supplies. We can work out credit. Appreciate that. Eleanor's voice was steady. I'll need basics. Flour, salt, coffee, some nails and rope. Eyed as she moved through the store, gathering items, aware of eyes following her. 3 young men lounged near the stove. Newcomers to the territory who'd arrived last spring, full of swagger and ignorance. She heard their voices. Not quite low enough. That's her. The one lost her place. Yep. Raiders burned her out completely. Hell of a thing. Woman alone like that. Can't even protect her own chickens. Laughter. Quick and cruel. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she continued shopping, maintaining her dignity even as heat crept up her neck. Of course. What did you expect? One of them continued. She's just a boy. You'd better shut your fool mouth. The voice cracked like a whip. Everyone turned. Old Ezra Thompson stood in the doorway, weathered as ancient leather, eyes hard as flint. He'd ranched these hills for 40 years and commanded respect through sheer endurance. That woman there, Ezra said, limping forward on his bad leg, I guess, has got more steel in her spine than you got in your whole worthless body. The young men shuffled, suddenly uncertain. The store had gone completely silent. 15 years ago. Mountain lions took 3 calves from her herd in 1 week. Ezra's voice filled the space. Her husband was laid up with a broken leg. Couldn't ride. So, Eleanor tracked those cats for 2 days into the high country. Found them in their den. He paused, letting the weight settle. She killed both with nothing but her husband's hunting knife. Dragged their bodies back as proof to stop future attacks. Saved their whole herd. Saved their future. Ezra looked at each young man in turn. That woman's got more courage than most men got in their best dreams. You'd do well to remember it. The store remained silent. The mockers wouldn't meet Eleanor's eyes now. One actually removed his hat, shame coloring his cheeks. Eleanor finished her shopping, paid her credit note with a steady signature. You're kinda now. She nodded thanks to Ezra, who touched his hat brim in return. Their eyes met briefly in understanding between people who'd survived hard things, walking home through gathering dusk. Eleanor let herself remember the weight of that knife. The 2 days of tracking through November snow, her breath frosting in the thin mountain air. The moment she'd chosen to engage rather than retreat, knowing the cats would return if she didn't stop them. The fear, sharp as broken glass. The terrible necessity of violence to protect what she loved. She flexed her hands. Still strong despite the years. The skin was more weathered now, marked by sun and work and time. But the strength underneath hadn't faded. Strength don't fade. She murmured to the twilight. It just waits for when you need it. Morning arrived with frost and the sound of a wagon. It's my bye. Eleanor emerged from her lean-to to find Father Samuel Brennan pulling up. 3 children peering from behind him like curious birds. Samuel was a widower himself, managing both a small congregation and a struggling farm. He'd buried his wife 3 years ago and raised his children alone. Thomas at 14, Jack at 11, and little Mary, who was 7. Eleanor had seen them in town, but never spoken beyond polite nods. Mrs. Carson! Samuel climbed down, his movements careful and deliberate. He was tall, lean from work, with gentle eyes that had seen sorrow. I hope I'm not intruding. That depends on why you're here. Eleanor kept her voice neutral. Samuel smiled slightly at her directness. I'm here to make an offer, not charity. He added quickly, seeing her shoulders stiffen. A business proposition. Mary peeked around her father's leg, eyes wide with curiosity. Eleanor noticed the child's dress was carefully mended, her face scrubbed clean. Samuel was trying his best. My land borders yours at Willow Creek, Samuel said. I've got 40 acres. You've got 60. Separately, we're both struggling. Together, we'd have enough grazing range and water rights to make something viable. Eleanor crossed her arms. You're proposing partnership. I am. Samuel met her gaze steadily. Pool our resources. Rebuild together. My children need someone to teach them survival skills I don't possess. You need hands to rebuild and, he hesitated, then continued honestly, a family to make it worthwhile. You need a mother for them, Eleanor said bluntly. I need a partner. Samuel's voice was firm. Someone who knows this land, who can teach them to survive it. They're growing up soft. Mrs. Carson, I can teach them scripture and carpentry, but I can't teach them to read weather or track game or understand when a storm's coming. Eleanor looked at the children. Thomas stood tall, trying to appear grown. Jack shifted nervously. Mary smiled shyly when their eyes met. What about the ranch? Eleanor asked. I'll be beside. Whose name would it carry? Both. The land would be ours, yours, and mine to pass to the children equally. Samuel pulled papers from his coat. I had it drawn up proper. Not a marriage contract, though folks will likely assume. A working partnership with shared ownership. Eleanor felt the familiar resistance rising. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat. Surrendering the independence she and her first husband had fought so hard to establish. She'd built this life alone after he died. Asking for help seemed like betraying that strength. But watching Mary peek out again, seeing the hope in Samuel's careful expression, Eleanor recognized something crucial. Her strength had never been about standing alone. It had been about protecting what mattered. These children mattered. This land mattered. Building something that would outlast her mattered more than pride. I'll teach them, Eleanor said finally. Everything I know about reading land, tracking game, surviving winters that would kill softer folk. In return, you help rebuild not my ranch. She paused, letting the words settle. Our ranch, Eleanor. Samuel's relief was visible. He extended his hand. Eleanor shook it firmly, feeling the calluses that matched her own. We start today, she said. Winter's coming fast. Mary tugged her father's sleeve. Papa, does this mean Miss Eleanor is staying? Samuel looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She nodded slowly. Yes, sweetheart. He said, Miss Eleanor is staying. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite hope yet, but the possibility of it. The first thaw after a long freeze. Work began at dawn. Samuel and Eleanor stood at Willow Creek, marking where the new ranch house would rise. The location was strategic position to serve both properties, near the creek that divided their lands. Here, Eleanor said, pointing to a slight rise. High enough to avoid spring flooding, sheltered from north wind by that rock face, good drainage. Samuel nodded, already sketching rough plans in a notebook. His carpenter skills were evident in every precise measurement. We'll need timber for the frame. I know a canyon about 3 miles north. Baxter Canyon. Eleanor smiled slightly. Good stands of pine. I'd forgotten about it. They worked side by side, their movements gradually finding rhythm. Samuel handled construction with quiet competence while Eleanor focused on teaching the boys. Thomas and Jack arrived with soft hands and town manners, but they learned quickly. See these tracks? Eleanor crouched, pointing to marks in the soft earth near the creek. Elk bedded here last night. You can tell by the pressed grass. Still holding shape. If you track back, She gestured upstream. You'll find where they came down to drink. Thomas studied the ground intently. How do you know it's elk and not deer? Size of the tracks. Depth of impression. Elk are heavier. Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Also, smell the air. Elk have a musk and rutting season. Faint. But they're... Jack sniffed cautiously. I don't smell anything. And you will. Takes time to wake up senses dulled by town living. Eleanor's voice was patient. Most folk walk through wilderness, blind and deaf. You're learning to see. Mary shadowed Eleanor constantly, fascinated by this woman who moved through the landscape with absolute confidence. When Eleanor checked the root cellar's stores, Mary was there. When Eleanor gathered kindling, small hands helped. The child asked endless questions, which Eleanor answered with surprising patience. Meanwhile, Samuel framed the cabin's first walls. Eleanor found herself watching his work, the careful measurements, the true corners, the plumb lines. He worked with the same quiet focus she brought to tracking. Different skills. Equal competence. You know your way around a hammer, she said during their midday break. Samuel smiled. My father was a carpenter. Taught me young. He gestured to the rising frame. Building's like praying. You put your faith in good foundations and hope the structure holds. And when storms come, you trust you built it right. His eyes held hers. That's what we're doing here. Isn't it building something meant to last? Small tensions emerged. Eleanor wanted to hunt immediately. Fresh meat would help their stores. Samuel worried about leaving the children unattended. They stood by the half-built cabin. Deadlocked. I can't be in two places, Samuel said firmly. They need supervision. Then I teach Thomas to hunt, Eleanor countered. Boy's old enough to handle a rifle. Samuel hesitated, fear flickering across his face. Eleanor recognized it, the fear of every parent who'd lost a spouse. One more risk. One more thing that could go wrong. I'll teach him safe, she said quietly. Same way my husband taught me. Respect for the weapon. Respect for the animal. He'll be fine. Samuel finally nodded. All right. But you bring him back safe. Eleanor took Thomas into the hills that afternoon. They moved slowly, her teaching him to read sign, to understand the land's language. When they found deer tracks, she showed him how to judge age. Direction. Probable location. Don't rush, she whispered as they crept through a stand of aspen. Patience is half the skill. Thomas's shot was clean when it came. The deer fell quickly. Suffering minimized. Eleanor helped him field dress it properly, teaching respect for the animal's sacrifice. You thank the land for providing, she said, her hands showing him how to work efficiently. Never waste. Never take more than you need. They returned at dusk, meat loaded carefully. Samuel's relief was palpable. Around the evening fire, eating fresh venison, the arrangement felt less like business partnership and more like something unspoken, but real. Mary leaned against Eleanor's shoulder, sleepy and content. Will you teach me to track too? Eleanor smiled, her first genuine smile since the burning. Tomorrow, little one, we start tomorrow. Rain came like judgment, turning the world gray and cold. For 3 days, heavy storms made outdoor work impossible. They huddled in the half-finished cabin. 5 people learning to exist in close quarters. The first day was awkward. They moved around each other carefully, avoiding touch, speaking in polite fragments. The second day, restlessness set in. By the third, forced intimacy demanded something more than courtesy. Tell us a story, Mary asked Eleanor during the afternoon lull. Rain drummed steadily on the partial roof. Papa says you're brave. Tell us about being brave. Eleanor looked at Samuel, who shrugged. They heard talk in town about the mountain lions. The three children watched her expectantly. Eleanor realized they'd spent days learning practical skills but knew almost nothing about her. Beside he dum baderdi, shrod. She'd kept herself carefully distant. Teacher, but not family. All right, she said finally. But first, your father tells a story. Fair is fair. Samuel looked surprised, then thoughtful. Very well. He settled back. Children gathering close. 3 years ago, when your mother... His voice caught slightly. When she got sick. I didn't know what to do. I was scared every minute. The doctor said fever. Keep her cool. Pray hard. So I did. But she got worse anyway. Mary climbed into his lap. Thomas and Jack moved closer. Eleanor watched Samuel's face, seeing old pain surface. The night she died, Samuel continued quietly. I felt like I'd failed everyone. Failed her. Failed you children. Failed God himself. Sat in the dark wondering how to go forward. He paused. But morning came anyway. You three needed breakfast. Chores needed doing. Life demanded I keep moving even when I wanted to stop. That's when I learned the difference between courage and strength. Strength is doing hard things. Courage is doing them anyway when you're broken inside. He looked at Eleanor. Your turn. Eleanor took a breath. The children shifted focus to her. She'd never told this story properly. It had become legend. Simplified. Made clean. Time to tell the truth. 15 years ago. November. Mountain lions hit our herd. Took 3 calves in a week. Her voice was steady but soft. My husband Jacob was laid up with a broken leg. Couldn't ride. Couldn't defend the stock. Someone had to stop the cats or we'd lose everything. So you went, Thomas said, after 2 days of tracking through snow. I spent a night in a cave. No fire. Temperatures dropping below freezing. Found the cat's den the second day. Eleanor's hands remembered the weight of the knife. I wasn't brave. I was terrified every second. But being scared don't mean you can't do what needs doing. Jack leaned forward. How'd you kill them? Carefully, quietly, and with more luck than skill. Eleanor met his eyes. Violence ain't something to celebrate. Boy, it was necessary to protect what I loved. That's all. Necessary and terrible, Mary asked the question her brothers wouldn't. Did you cry? Eleanor nodded slowly. When it was done and Jacob was safe and our herd was protected, I cried for a whole day, then got up and kept going. She looked at Samuel. Same as your papa did. Why, courage ain't the absence of fear. Eleanor continued. It's moving forward despite it. Doing what needs doing even when you're shaking inside. Understanding that breaking don't mean you're broken forever. Silence settled. Rain filling it with gentle percussion. The children absorbed this, seeing both adults differently now. Not invincible, but human. Scared and brave at once. Later. after the children slept. Eleanor and Samuel sat by the small fire. Their shoulders nearly touched in the confined space. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing them it's all right to be scared. Someone should have shown me that when I was young." Eleanor stared into flames. "Might have saved years of trying to be harder than I needed to be." Samuel's hand moved slightly toward hers, then stopped. The gesture hung between them. Awareness. Possibility. Question. Eleanor didn't pull away. Didn't move closer either. Just sat there, feeling something shift in her chest like spring ice beginning to crack. "This partnership," Samuel said carefully. "It's working better than I hoped." "It is," Eleanor agreed. Neither said what they were both thinking, that partnership was beginning to feel like something more. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, 5 people sat together in firelight, finding warmth in unexpected places. The blizzard hit without warning. One moment, clear skies and cold sun. The next, wind screaming down from the mountains, bringing snow so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. They barely made it to the cabin. Samuel grabbed Mary while Thomas and Jack helped Eleanor secure the horses in the makeshift shelter. Snow already accumulated fast. Wind driving it horizontal. Inside, they counted blessings. The cabin was mostly finished, roof complete. Walls solid. Door and shutters in place. They had firewood, food, water from the creek gathered that morning. They'd survive. But that night, Mary started coughing. By morning, she burned with fever. Samuel held his daughter with shaking hands, terror naked on his face. Eleanor touched Mary's forehead, hot as coals. The child's breathing rattled, congested and labored. "The doctor," Samuel said desperately. "We need to get her to town." Eleanor looked out at white fury. 3 feet of snow already. More falling. Visibility 0. 15 miles to town through this would kill them both. "We can't!" Eleanor's voice was firm. "We'd die trying, and she'd die anyway." "Then what?" Samuel's eyes pleaded. I can't lose her too." Eleanor recognized that fear. She'd seen it before. Worn it herself. The terror of helplessness, of having no control over whether someone you love lives or dies. "We fight it here." Eleanor moved into action, decisive. "This ain't the fever that took your wife. I've seen it before. Lung inflammation from cold air. Dangerous. But we can treat it." She boiled water for steam, created a tent over Mary's bed from blankets, pine needle tea, brewed strong for its medicinal properties, warm compresses on the chest, constant monitoring, constant care. Samuel and Eleanor took shifts through that day and night. One always awake, always watching. Thomas and Jack helped fetching water, stoking fire, preparing food nobody ate. The cabin became a field hospital, everyone focused on one fragile life. The second night was worst. Mary's fever spiked higher, her breathing growing more labored. She couldn't stay awake, drifting in and out of consciousness. Samuel sat rigid with fear, watching his daughter fight. Eleanor took over, lifting Mary gently. The child was limp, burning. Eleanor held her close, began singing a Spanish lullaby her own mother had taught her decades ago. Words she hadn't spoken since childhood, melody rising from some deep place of memory. Duerme, duerme. Negrito. Que tu mamá está en el campo. Negrito. Mary's breathing eased slightly. Eleanor continued singing, rocking slowly. Samuel watched them. seeing something he'd never noticed before. Eleanor's fierce capability wasn't armor. It was love made practical. Protection made physical. You could have run for the doctor, Samuel whispered. Tried the trail. Most would have. Eleanor shook her head, still singing between words. Sometimes the brave thing is staying put. Being present. Not running toward danger or away from it. Just holding steady. Right where you're needed. She looked at him fully. That's what you did after your wife died. You stayed. You held these children together when easier would have been falling apart. Don't tell me that ain't courage. Samuel's eyes filled. He moved closer, placing his hand over Eleanor's where it held Mary. For a moment, they stayed like that, two adults keeping vigil over a child they both loved. Partnership, deepening into something neither had words for yet. By dawn, Mary's fever broke. The child slept peacefully, breathing clear and steady. Eleanor and Samuel sat exhausted, hands still clasped, neither willing to break contact. Mary's eyes fluttered open. "Mama," she whispered, looking at Eleanor. Eleanor's breath caught. The word hung there, impossible and perfect. I'm here. Little one. I'm right here. Mary smiled weakly and drifted back to sleep. Samuel squeezed Eleanor's hand. Outside. The blizzard began to ease. Inside. Something fundamental had shifted. They were a family now, not by law or plan, but by the simple truth of caring for each other through the worst night of winter. The raiders returned 5 days later, not to attack, but to deliver something worse, legal papers. Eleanor and Samuel were checking fence lines when 4 riders appeared. Отекстid Vaochni, the same men who'd burned her ranch, now dressed in town clothes, looking pleased with themselves. By Mrs. Carson, the leader said, smirking. Or should I say, Mrs. Nobody seems you abandoned your property. We filed a claim with the territorial judge. Eleanor went very still. That land is mine. Was yours? Legal precedent says abandoned property reverts to available claim. He unfolded papers, made a show of reading. No structures, no visible occupation, no registered residence. Looks abandoned to us. You burned it! Fury cracked through Eleanor's control. You destroyed my home and now claim abandonment. Can't prove we did anything, but we can prove you ain't been living there. The raider looked at Samuel dismissively. Playing house with the preacher don't constitute proper occupation, lady. That land's ours now. Legal and proper. They rode off laughing, leaving Eleanor standing in snow. Rage and despair warring inside her. Everything she'd survived the burning for her husband's legacy. The land they'd broken together could be stolen through legal manipulation. Samuel reached for her. Eleanor pulled away, pacing like a caged animal. Her warrior instincts screamed to follow those men. To fight. To take back what was rightfully hers. The old Eleanor, the one who'd tracked mountain lions, would have saddled up immediately. Eleanor. Samuel started. Don't. Her voice was sharp. Don't tell me to let it go. I wasn't going to. Samuel stood firm. I was going to say you can't fight this one with a knife. The words hit hard. Eleanor spun to face him. Seeing truth instead of criticism, he was right. Individual courage wasn't enough against systemic injustice. This battle required different weapons. That realization broke something in her. Eleanor sank onto a fence rail, head in hands. I don't know how to fight this. Then we learned together. Samuel sat beside her. You taught me about mountain lions. I'll teach you about legal claims and territorial law. Eleanor looked up, seeing steady determination in his face. Why, this ain't your fight. Yes, it is. Samuel's voice was quiet but absolute. That land connects to ours. You're my partner. Your fight is mine. Eleanor, that's what partnership means. That night, Samuel gathered everyone around the cabin table: Thomas, Jack, Mary, and Eleanor, deliberately including her, making clear she belonged. We need a strategy, Samuel said. The judge makes his circuit through town next week. We present our case then. Thomas spoke up first. Old Mr. Thompson. He knew Mrs. Carson back when she first claimed the land. He'd be a witness. The preacher who married her and her first husband. Jack added, he might have records. Mary, still weak from fever but fierce, said everyone in town knows she never left. We're witnesses too. Eleanor listened to them planning, defending, strategizing. Samuel laid out legal precedents, territorial statutes, requirements for valid claims. He'd clearly been researching, preparing, understanding this would be their battle. I can't ask you all to do this, Eleanor said quietly. You're not asking. Samuel met her eyes. We're offering, this isn't just your fight anymore. Eleanor, it's our land now, our future. We defend it together. The word echoed together. Not Eleanor alone, with knife and courage. Not Samuel managing by himself. Not children learning to survive separately. Together, as a unit, as family. Eleanor looked at the faces around the table. Samuel steady and strategic. Thomas and Jack determined and growing. Mary fierce. Despite her small size, they were hers now. Not through blood or marriage certificate, but through the harder bonds of choice and care. And all right, she said, voice thick. Together then, we defend our home together. Samuel reached across the table, took her hand properly this time. The boys added theirs. Mary's small palm completed the circle. Outside. Wind howled. Inside. 5 people made silent promises to stand together, to fight as family, to build something unshakable no matter what came. The land office was packed. Eleanor stood beside Samuel, his children flanking them, facing the territorial judge in a room full of witnesses. The raiders sat confident and smirking. Certain of victory, Judge Morrison was old territorial stock, weathered and sharp-eyed. He'd heard every variation of claim jumping, fraud, and legal maneuvering the frontier offered. He looked bored. The petitioners claim abandonment, he said flatly. Mrs. Carson, you have 5 minutes to present your defense. Eleanor stood. She dressed carefully clean clothes, hair properly pinned, presenting dignity without vanity. Samuel had coached her state facts. No emotion. Let witnesses speak, Your Honor. I've occupied that land for 20 years, continuously and without interruption. Her voice was steady. The structures were destroyed by criminal action. That don't constitute abandonment. Can you prove the destruction was criminal? The judge asked. No, sir. The raiders weren't caught. Eleanor held his gaze. But absence of proof ain't proof of absence. The law requires visible occupation. Structures. Improvements. Can you demonstrate that I can provide witnesses to my original claim, my continuous residence. and my ongoing management of the property. The judge nodded. Proceed. Ezra Thompson went first. The old rancher limped forward, weathered and credible. Known Eleanor Carson for 18 years. Watched her and her late husband build that ranch from nothing. She ain't never left that land. Not for more than a day or two. That's continuous occupation in anybody's book, the store owner testified next. Mrs. Carson's been purchasing supplies regular for 2 decades. Always paid her debts. Always been a good neighbor. The preacher who'd married Eleanor and her first husband. Produced records. Wedding certificate. Land transfer documents. All properly filed. Mrs. Carson inherited legal title. That claim is legitimate and continuous. Then Samuel spoke. I own the adjacent property. Mrs. Carson and I have entered a legal partnership, combining our lands for joint operation. The new ranch house we're building sits partially on her original claim. Construction ongoing. Occupation is not just continuous, it's expanding. The Raiders' lawyer objected. This so-called partnership is just recent. After the alleged burning, convenient timing, partnership is a recognized legal arrangement, Samuel countered. The timing is irrelevant to the validity of her original claim. Judge Morrison looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Carson, why should this court rule in your favor when you've been living in a lean-to instead of properly occupying your claim? Eleanor felt everyone watching. This was the moment Samuel had warned about the question that could break their case. She thought of Mary calling her mama, of Thomas's successful hunt, of nights by the fire teaching these children to survive. She thought of the blackened cup she'd saved. Something scarred but unbroken. Your Honor, she said quietly, occupation ain't just 4 walls. It's sweat in the soil. It's knowing every drawn canyon, every water source and shelter. It's teaching the next generation to survive on this land and passing on knowledge that keeps them alive. She paused. I've never stopped occupying that property, not in spirit, not in knowledge, not in purpose, and I never will. The courtroom went completely silent. Eleanor saw the judge's expression shift, recognition of truth spoken plain. Furthermore, she continued, I'm rebuilding. With partners. Building something stronger than what stood before. That's not abandonment. Your Honor, that's renewal. Judge Morrison considered for a long moment. Then he spoke. The petitioner's claim is dismissed. Mrs. Carson's title stands, continuous and legitimate. Moreover, he consulted documents. I'm officially recognizing the partnership arrangement between Eleanor Carson and Samuel Brennan, validating their combined property under joint ownership. He looked at Eleanor and Samuel. Congratulations. By territorial common law, your joint filing constitutes marriage recognition. You're now legally Mr. and Mrs. Brennan. Eleanor and Samuel exchanged startled glances. They hadn't intended actual marriage, just partnership. But looking at Samuel's surprised smile, seeing the children's excited faces, Eleanor realized the law had simply made official what was already true. Outside the land office, Mary threw herself at Eleanor. Does this mean you're really my mama now? Legal and everything? Eleanor knelt, meeting the child's eyes. Something in her chest cracked open, letting light in. If you'll have me, little one. I will. Mary's hug was fierce. I will. I will. I will. Thomas and Jack crowded in, awkward but happy. Samuel stood back, watching his family become whole. Eleanor reached out, pulled him into the embrace. They stood together in the winter sun, 5 people who'd chosen each other despite everything. Riding home. Samuel asked quietly, "How does it feel being legally married?" Eleanor laughed. First real laugh in months. Feels like we just made official what was already true. Spring came early. Melting snows with unusual warmth. The completed ranch house stood solid and true, where 2 properties joined at Willow Creek. Not large, but sturdy. Built to last through generations. Eleanor stood on the new porch, watching morning sun paint the mountains gold. Behind her, the house was alive with family sounds, Mary singing off-key while setting the table, boys arguing good-naturedly about chores. Samuel's steady voice bringing order to chaos. The land had transformed. Garden plots were marked and ready for planting. The fence line ran true and strong, marking boundaries that were no longer about separation, but connection. Cattle grazed on combined pastures, their brands side by side. 2 struggling properties had become one thriving ranch. Eleanor held the fire-blackened cup she'd saved from the ruins. She'd kept it all these months. Not from sentiment exactly, but as a reminder. Something scarred but unbroken. Something that survived fire and became foundation for what came after. Samuel stepped out, bringing fresh coffee in a new cup. He handed it to her, then settled beside her on the porch rail. Comfortable silence stretched between them, the ease of people who'd weathered hard things together. "Thinking about the old place?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Thinking about this one, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you clears ground for the best thing you never imagined." Out in the distance, all 3 children explored the creek, Thomas teaching his siblings to read tracks like Eleanor had taught him. Metsa, Bidisil. Mary crouched carefully, studying elk prints with fierce concentration. Jack pointed out bird nests with the careful eye he'd developed. They were growing strong, capable, ready for frontier life. The combined ranch thrived in ways neither property alone could have. Their water rights gave them advantage during dry season. Shared grazing meant better land management. Complementary skills, Eleanor's wilderness knowledge. Samuel's carpentry and community connections created something greater than sum of parts. Neighbors had noticed. Just last week, 2 struggling ranchers stopped by seeking advice about partnership arrangements. Eleanor and Samuel found themselves teaching not just their children, but the community. A new model strength through cooperation instead of competition. We should teach Mary to whittle, Eleanor said. "She's old enough now." Samuel smiled. "She's been pestering me for a knife for weeks." And that afternoon, Eleanor sat on the porch with Mary between her knees, teaching her to carve. The girl held a small knife carefully, learning to respect the tool. "Remember," Eleanor said, guiding Mary's hands, "the knife's a tool, not a weapon. You use it to build, to create, to solve problems. Same strength that can fight can also make something beautiful." As Mary concentrated fiercely, tongue between teeth, shaving careful curls from a stick. "Like you with the mountain lions?" "Exactly like that." Eleanor helped adjust her grip. "I used the knife because I had to. But every day after, I used it to build fences, carve handles, fix tools. The strength don't change, just what you do with it." Her bare hands might. Samuel watched from the doorway, seeing his daughter learn not just skill, but philosophy. Eleanor teaching the next generation that power came with choice, that strength meant more than violence, that survival included knowing when to fight and when to build. Evening settled gently. Eleanor walked to the spot where her old ranch house had stood. Yonsa. Now. The new house rose behind her, larger, stronger, belonging to all of them. The charred ground had been cleared. New grass already growing. In another year, you wouldn't be able to tell destruction had ever touched this place. Samuel joined her, understanding without words why she'd come here, to measure the distance traveled, to honor what was lost, to acknowledge what had been gained. You ever regret it? Eleanor asked quietly, taking on a widow and her burned-out land. Samuel took her hand, lacing their fingers together. I took on a partner who made me stronger, who taught my children to survive, who became family when I thought I'd never have one again. He smiled. No, Eleanor, I don't regret it. And they stood together, watching sunset paint the sky in possible colors. Their children's laughter echoed from the barn. At Eastansea, the land stretched around them, productive and peaceful, promising future harvests. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since before the burning peace. Not the peace of having survived, though she had. Not the peace of having won, though they had. The peace of having found home in the last place she'd expected in partnership, in family, in the unshakable strength of shared purpose. Some strength you're born with, Eleanor said quietly, echoing lessons she'd learned and would keep teaching. Some you earn in blood and fear and necessity, but the strongest kind. She looked at Samuel, at their home, at the future they'd built together. That's the strength you build together, stone by stone, season after season, until nothing in this world can shake it. Samuel pulled her close, behind them. The house glowed warm with lamplight. Before them, the land stretched toward mountains that had witnessed her worst and best moments. Around them, a family flourished, chosen, defended, maintained through courage that came in many forms. The blackened cup sat on a shelf inside, reminder that what survives fire can become foundation. That destruction doesn't mean ending. That the hardest things teach the most valuable lessons: to accept help, to share strength, to build together instead of standing alone. Eleanor Brennan, no longer Carson, no longer alone, walked back to her home, her family, her future. Built not in spite of the burning, but because of it. Built with people who'd chosen each other when the world offered only ashes. Built to last.